Liberal Currents presents Half the Answer with your hosts, Caitlin M. Green and Trent R. Nelson.
Welcome to Half the Answer, where knowing what question to ask is half the answer. Today we have Dr. Bradford Vivian. He is a professor of communication arts and sciences at Penn State. He's received prizes for his scholarship in rhetoric and public address, and his newest book is Campus Misinformation, The Real Threat to Free Speech in American Higher Education, published by Oxford University Press, which also has published a chapter of mine. So we're like cousins. I am so excited to talk to you about this book. It is rare that I find a book and I breathe a sigh of relief because finally it's something that's out there.
Thank you.
I will register my bias right now, which is that obviously I have been involved in some campus misinformation on the target end. And so this is really an exciting thing to get to see. So I wanted to jump right in and ask you some things about yourself and some things about what's in the book.
Terrific. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited. What is it that made you interested in analyzing polemics about college campuses in the first place?
A real disparity that I was experiencing around 2017. And in the book, I talk about how there's a timeline to the growth of what I call misinformation about university campuses. And if you remember, that was after the 2016 election, and there was just a general ramp up of what it seems totally objective to call now authoritarian populist sentiment in our civic institutions.
Right.
And one big leading edge of that was to try and promote a lot of extremism on college campuses and also extremist rhetoric about college campuses. And I started experiencing these weird disparities where I didn't have so much direct conversation with people who had a lot of wild preconceived notions, but a lot of my colleagues did, notions about university campuses. And one in particular was a 40-plus year faculty member at Penn State who would have what's now a kind of typical conversation in an airport or sitting next to somebody on an airplane, and had to sort of convince the person that actually what they were describing as the shrill, coddled, overly emotional, triggered nature of faculty and students was really not representative and was more of an invented media polemic than any kind of objective description of universities and the many positive goods they give to society. So this was, to me, just on the basis of some of my background, more teaching than research. How do you look at an argument and diagnose what the evidence is, if that evidence is credible, if the warrant for a certain set of claims holds up in terms of logical reasoning patterns? And it seemed like we had a pretty clear misinformation campaign here. And that's what I continue to call it. And I think it's actually kind of even gone on steroids compared to when I first wrote the book.
Right. So in 2017, where were you?
I was at Penn State, and part of what I think put my antennae up about these forms of misinformation was I was serving simultaneously as the director of something on campus called the Center for Democratic Deliberation. It tries to foster good deliberative culture about important democratic issues and how do we talk about these things responsibly. And at the same time, I was our director of undergraduate studies in my home department, communication arts and sciences. So I was thinking about democracy a lot and erosions of democracy. And I was also closely engaged with a lot of undergraduate students who do amazing work, who need a lot of supports because many kinds of supports have been taken away over the past generation or two to make academic life successful. So in essence, I just didn't think it was fair how they were being talked about or it was democratically productive.
Yeah. So in 2017, I was a grad student almost done with my PhD at UC Davis, which means that I was responsible for teaching some classes at the same time. So, all of the stuff that I was hearing outside of the campus was simply not matching up, right, with what was happening on campus. So I'm totally with you there. It seemed like it was something to dig into.
And Dr. Vivian, can we sort of jump back for a second and look at what is the aim for folks who are trying to assert these things to the general public? What is their sort of macro goal?
That's a great question, because part of my concern was looking at how in the late 2010s leading up until now, there's been a rise, not just in extremist rhetoric about universities, but it's come out of hyper-partisan quarters of society and it seemed to have a lot of broad centrist, even stereotypically liberal appeal to denigrate college campuses and spread these vast overgeneralizations. So I think your question is great because it's functional for a lot of people. There's a value and utility. So on the one hand, there's just a long-term reactionary movement in the country that has never liked the idea of fully desegregated institutions of higher ed that serve the general public.
Right.
But that by itself is not enough to kind of create the wave of what we've seen. So I think it also, in the age of a lot of hyperpartisan online media and social media and so forth, there's a kind of influencer quotient of a lot of this misinformation where, you know, somebody visits a campus and they film an undergraduate or two saying something sensational or maybe, you know, not acting terribly polite during a speaking situation.
Right.
And then this becomes a way for them to promote themselves as an allegedly informed intellectual commentator. Look what's happening on these college campuses. And I think from that basis, it's become on an even larger scale above the kind of individual influencers that want to promote themselves by using campuses negatively for publicity. I think on the national scale, it's become a revenue generator. If you think about the fact that newspapers have been losing subscribers a lot, but the opinion pages of those newspapers we know are major feeders of potential subscriptions and revenue. And look at the drumbeat that's kept up in the New York Times and the Washington Post and Wall Street Journal. It's literally a weekly kind of campus beat, which is not accurate investigative reporting about higher ed, which those papers do to great quality. It's kind of all these, as you said, Caitlin, it's these polemics and pieces of half information, which drive subscriptions, they drive numbers and attention and so forth, and give a revenue boost. And so I think the media has really latched onto this as well.
Yeah. So if you're just like a regular person, you're not going on campus day to day, you are, you know, you think of yourself as fairly well informed and good at assessing arguments, but you don't see it, right? Given the media landscape at this time, what is your perception of what happens on campuses, what students are like, what professors are like?
It's remarkably diverse. It will always depend on the case. And that's my leading response to a lot of the headlines or leads where it's predicated on the idea that you can draw a uniform assessment and a largely negative one. There's about 47,000 different institutions of post-secondary education in the U.S., and they're remarkably diverse and decentralized. So sure, on some college campuses, if you want to think in terms of stereotypical liberal and conservative or whatnot political affiliations, you might walk around on a liberal arts institution or an Ivy and so forth and be struck by what you just knee-jerk reflexive call liberalism going on there. But even there, that's just a small slice of what happens on a campus. Most of teaching and research, you never need to use that vocabulary because it's simply not pertinent. And if you're just kind of walking around and looking at students and noticing that, you know, they have a tattoo or a piercing or whatever and drawing conclusions from that, you're not looking at what happens in the boards of trustees, the decision-making boards, the alumni donor relations, which are multi-million-dollar enterprises where the decision-making really lies.
Yeah.
Most of the power on a college campus is not going to be undergraduates sitting in the quad. But even so, you know, by that same token, sure, we have institutions that you might be prone to call stereotypically liberal. There are many Bible-based institutions in the U.S.
Right.
They're privately funded. There are many vocational schools, large state schools, small state Commonwealth campuses. And in all of these cases, to draw a kind of straight line and put everything in one category is empirically irresponsible. In my view, you should never get away with making that kind of claim in a well-graded introductory student essay, like in a basic writing program.
But it serves, sir, a certain purpose to slather everything with one brush, to sort of make it quantifiably easy to understand. All learning is this type of thing. And
Yeah.
so we don't have to really parse through anything with a fine-tooth comb. We just know that all of this is no good.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you look at those op-eds, right? Like they're like, what's going on college campuses? And then they really are only looking at Ivies and a couple of other, really, really elite institutions, right? They're not talking about where the vast majority of college students actually are.
Or even just
Right.
these little bits, right? As you were saying, Dr. Vivian, right? Just these like little segments, like saying that the civics people playing hacky sack in a quad is representative of like all of Princeton. I mean, that's absolutely crazy. No one would do that. You'd never do that anywhere.
Right.
From a data gathering standpoint, it doesn't make any sense, actually.
Yeah.
You're right. And some of these campuses, even like the Bible-based ones, they actually embrace DEI principles, for example. So you need to think about the complexity of every single institution on its own terms.
Right. So you mentioned DEI. That's kind of one of the big buzzwords right now. And I was wondering if you could outline what DEI actually looks like on a campus. Like, what are things that are DEI and what are things that are called DEI, but they're just something else?
So DEI is mostly aspirational. The big mythology about it is that it's some kind of centralized power on every college campus and uniform across different institutions that pulls the trigger on important decisions, that it dictates hiring, it dictates what can be said or not in a classroom, that it dictates research. That's purely a mythology. It's really no one thing, and I mean that non-evasively at all. It looks different on different campuses. It may or may not be present to certain degrees. DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion is something borrowed from the corporate world on college campuses. Over the past couple of generations, affirmative action through various court orders was winnowed down to a shell of its former self. And so institutions in our public life then said, well, what else can we do? Because late 90s, early 2000s, even conservatives were pretty on board with the idea of just generally that promoting diversity and equitable hiring and fairness and so forth in the workplace or educational spaces was a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
So corporations, particularly post George Floyd, made a big show in the private sector of wanting to be, on the right side of history and social values. And so corporations adopted these DEI principles. And universities then said, well, affirmative action has been winnowed down to a sliver. What else can we do that will be legally okay, that will be okay and actually sort of in the more quasi-corporate leadership structure of a lot of universities today? The natural answer was these kind of DEI programs and publicity and values statements. But that's been too much for the extremists lately, who have been on a real tear and have consolidated political power in favor of what I call kind of resegregationist movement. So DEI on a campus, I can just speak from my experience. I only ever used that acronym for the past few years or heard it on a college campus, and I'm over 20 years in 3 different institutions. DEI basically is a set of offices that try through diplomacy to say, hey, on a departmental basis, are people aware that these are the civil rights laws? When you hire, you at least need to try and have a diverse faculty pool. A DEI officer, whatever that might be, will not say, here's who you have to hire and who you can't hire because that's illegal. So it's aspirational. It's a lot of goodwill and messaging and values. And it's not something that has, in my 20 plus career, ever dictated anything that I do.
Yeah. What about like trainings that you have to take as an employee of the university? Are those DEI?
So the training complaint genre of op-eds is one of my favorites because it's usually never based in anything substantive. The big revelation of a lot of these op-eds where they say, oh, I was taken through this, training about diversity and how I have to treat people equitably and watch my microaggressive language and so forth in the educational space. These are designed to make that seem like an enormously onerous and burdensome and offensive kind of task. And My question would be, so what you're telling me is you're discovering that sometimes corporate style trainings are irritating or maybe superfluous.
Right.
That's not the hugest revelation. And if you would use that logic to go into any Fortune 500 company, the amount of trainings need to be done it's just not it's a kind of thing where I'm tempted to say, can you just kind of be a little more professional, get yourself together, and
Yeah.
we all have to do this. And it's probably, if you have a better suggestion, if you agree on the goal of making the workplace safe and equitable and making education about treating people fairly wherever they come from, whoever they are, then suggest a better alternative to me. And the last thing I'll say on that is the danger of that genre is it obscures the fact that, for instance, I, as a member of Penn State University and a lot of public institutions, I'm required to do a training every year by law, by state law, because of a child sexual assault scandal that occurred on Penn State campus that was national news, the Sandusky affair. So I'm a mandatory state reporter. If I see something, there's procedures I have to know, and it's responsible to make sure I know what the procedures are for the communal safety and welfare. And that's a really serious thing. And so for these polemics to make it look like these university trainings are superfluous is really dangerous, in my opinion.
Yeah, I've done mandatory reporter training, and it's not always completely intuitive either, like what the actual system is. So it is something that people need to explicitly learn as opposed to just sort of follow your heart.
Dr. Vivian, you brought up something that I kind of wanted to dive into a little bit further, because when you were just referring to the DEI policies and how the polemics often attempt to make it feel as though it's like this great burden, right? And I feel like I see this often in the transgender discussion, particularly, where it is like such a huge deal to call Sally by the pronoun that she chooses. And I'm always just struck whenever I hear these arguments with, like, is it difficult when you call grandma grandma? How do you judge this difficulty? It seems as though there's something else there that you're just using, as you noted, this to sort of obscure.
Well, there's a few things going on there that comes back to the symbolism of the universities and also the functional place, the functional role it plays in society. And I think it is related to the transgender movement of the past generation. And one of the reasons why, coming back to one of your original questions, Trent, why anti-university rhetoric serves certain constituencies is traditionally authoritarians don't like universities, because even within relatively closed societies, universities are going to be the places where if there are any cracks in the proverbial door and a little bit of opening for questioning authority, questioning social norms and political rules, and even questioning, like, who is a human being who deserves equal rights. Even in certain authoritarian states, you're going to get seeds of that. And the transgender movement has been very destabilizing for a significant portion of the United States. And what preceded it in the early 2000s was a lot of self-described conservative intellectuals making common cause around the world in the wake of the same-sex Supreme Court rulings, same-sex marriage ruling, that being legalized here. That was, for those communities, a kind of catastrophic, near-apocalyptic event. I'm not making that language up. It's supposed to be in the writings of certain conservative intellectuals at Ivy Leagues, kind of a forewarning of the doom of our civilization. And so then when you work in the fact that universities are the places where the most openness to different styles of life, forms of humanity, sexual and gender diversity are going to be affirmatively talked about. And universities are also the places where scientists are able to say, actually, there's a hell of a lot of sexual and gender diversity in nature as well as human nature, based on scientific fact, not ideology to put people in these narrow boxes. So I think the presence of affirmative messages for transgender students and faculty on campuses, it sticks out in comparison to different parts of society. And it also plays a leadership role in trying to get people to think differently. And so we're seeing massive reactions to that. And on a college campus, yes, there's a presence there of transgender communities, feminist communities, also traditional communities, conservative ones. It's a place where we try and mix and moderate. But taken in certain hands, it becomes this, as I said, this like apocalyptic thing designed to manufacture outrage.
This language policing kind of rhetoric strain is really interesting, right? Because it takes examples of times when language has changed on its own, or when certain groups have a preference, and it transmutes them into looking like some kind of authoritarian control in itself. So how exactly is that accomplished?
In terms of outside groups or on campus trying to police what people say?
Yeah, like how are the polemicists convincing people that a word being popular is actually the same thing as like the thought police?
Right. I mean, there's been a long-term effort to promote a very distorted idea of what a policing speech actually looks like, and also what infringements on First Amendment liberties are all about. There's a quotient, because I use the term misinformation. Misinformation is not things completely fabricated. It's that they're wildly exaggerated or polemicized, where you take individual isolated facts or anecdotes, but then you use them to tell outlandish stories where the meaning, the responsible meaning of those original reference loses all sense together. So sure, on a university campus, in a bureaucracy which is run by a billion different conflicting state and federal laws and regulations, there are going to be times where you get advice from your superiors or whatnot. This is how you say it. You're allowed to kind of, use this argument or not. So there's sort of language norming that goes on all the time. And then there are also social pressures where a particular social or political cause becomes fashionable in a learning community or a bureaucracy, and then you sort of feel the pressure to go along with the crowd. That's not reducible to any sort of stereotypically liberal or progressive ideology. That's something that happens in human nature and is happening right now across all kinds of social groups. So that's what I mean about where we take these anecdotes, where you have anecdotes about student groups who ask people to sign petitions to, enlist in this cause and adopt this kind of argument and to wave this kind of sign or flag or whatever it might be. So those are kind of pressures of conformity and social norming that we deal with all the time. But in the hands of irresponsible polemicists, that's become as if it were the greatest threat to free speech that Western civilization has seen. And the remedy there is to engage and have a respectful two-way discussion about people who ask you to use certain kinds of pronouns or recognize their different ways of living, and not to wrap everybody into a denigrating package all at once.
Yeah. I loved in your book your list of metaphors that got used for things that were like just very basic, normal things that happen on campuses, like a protest or a letter or a word becoming in vogue, right? Where the metaphor that people would use were like, it's like Orwell, it's like a Maoist struggle session, it's like a Stalinist gulag. And it's like, I think you might be stretching the reality there if you really do think that like sitting in a meeting that you didn't 100% enjoy is the same thing as being sent to Siberia.
Well, this even goes back to the metaphor that you started with of language policing or speech police. That's
thought police. And
there's always a layer of hyperbole that gets us away from actually describing the situation as it is. And that refers to the fact that for a long time, conservative student chapters on campuses, particularly in California as a shout out, were engaged in trying to find ways to push rules about on-campus conduct and speech, and essentially interfere with other student groups' demonstrations. And so the policing there is not policing at all. It's just saying, you be over here, you be over here. Everybody gets an equal shot. Don't, mess with them. That's not language policing, or that's not a speech police. That's trying to get along, essentially.
Right. And Dr. Vivian, it seems that, again, as I walk through the society and listen to the lovely folks that we share existence with, I'm often struck by their interpretation of what freedom of speech means. We talk about freedom of speech, this, that, the other thing, but it's like we're all just missing each other constantly. just constantly flying.
Uh,
And many folks praise freedom of speech as though it's like the ability to say anything without anyone reacting in
Mhm.
some type of functional manner.
Let's
Yeah,
talk about First Amendment hardball. First Amendment hardball.
that concept. Yeah, absolutely. Well, they're part of why I think this issue of misinformation about college campuses is important is because it should matter to people, even if they're not members of university communities. These campuses are places where pro-authoritarian leaders beta test authoritarian tactics to curb civil liberties. And if they can do it with what are supposed to be truth-telling institutions and research-based institutions like universities, then they get experience doing it for other civic institutions like the free press. So, yes, a lot of this misinformation about campuses, particularly in the alleged free speech crisis of the late 2010s, it rendered the idea of free speech synonymous with the idea that as a privileged person who has extreme views, I have a right to give a speech in any way I want, wherever I want on a university campus without anybody disagreeing with me. Violent protest is always unacceptable. And, the more constructive engagement on all sides is always the best thing. But if you as a speaker encounter a nonviolent protest and you claim that's inhibiting your free speech, protest is free speech. Counter speech is an important part of the First Amendment. And the First Amendment is not supposed to be a document designed to promote passive listening and civility and deference to authority at all costs. It's actually incredibly democratic and it embraces dissent. It's supposed to be a document that says the state doesn't dictate rules for what peaceful free expression is. You people have to work it out yourselves. You have to debate and deliberate and contest one another's speech. Contesting norms of speech is part of free speech. So this was a manufactured controversy, again, to get extremist views normalized on campus and to quash dissent against particularly a rise in transphobia, homophobia, misogynistic, anti-Semitic kinds of messages. It was about normalizing those on campuses and saying it's a free speech crisis unless everybody politely sits and is deferential to those messages, when the people on those campuses probably know better than a lot of the public that they're wrong, they're scientifically false, they're politically, socially, and even economically destructive, and they're against some of the founding principles of the country. So, yeah, that has helped normalize some really bad ideas about free speech.
And again, I love how you said that, right? It's not freedom of speech unless I listen to the person say that Jewish people are like terrible monsters, right? That seems to me, and I say this to folks when they bring this argument, find me a civilization across human existence that has just been like, yeah, say whatever you want, no one cares, right?
Mm-hmm.
No, we're humans, we have feelings.
Have restrictions based on, you have to weigh it against other needs, right, for a society to function.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really interesting that we have this sort of like strategic forgetting where you have to pretend like the first time Richard Spencer opens his mouth, it could suddenly be correct, right? That like you have to take him as if you're a newborn baby born 2 minutes ago and you've never heard of or about him. And you just have to sit quietly and wait for him to finish speaking before you decide that it was anti-Semitic or misogynist or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
The expectation is so high for us to entertain bad arguments, regardless of whether we know that it's going to be a bad argument. And it never really goes the other way, does it?
Right. Well, in these cases, I always think it's what question are we asking and what facet of a speaking situation are we talking about? Because I personally, I don't find his views are horrifying or people like that, but I also don't find them particularly interesting. I'm not interested in participating.
Not unique or new.
Right.
Yeah, in the theater as well. And so what's been normalized weirdly is that you don't support free speech if you don't go and politely listen and defer to a privileged authority figure with extremist views. And what I'd like to kind of renormalize is the idea that it's shocking to a lot of polemicists that people can think what they want. it's okay to reject things out of hand if you've seen these arguments before and if you know better based on your education. And in fact, that's what an educational space is all about. It's about reaching judgments based on evidence about extremist views as well as more normalized or mainstream ones. So that's kind of what we're supposed to be doing in terms of rendering judgments.
Right. And like, I didn't violate anybody's free speech by not taking advanced calculus, right? And not hearing out that professor, right? Like you, by being on a college campus, you're surrounded by so much input. You have to filter, you have to make choices about what you're going to expose yourself to anyway. So yeah, exactly. The expectation is just wildly out of proportion.
Mm-hmm.
Did you see this? I'm going to bring us to current events. This morning, a peek behind the curtain is it's March 4th today.
Mm-hmm.
And did you see what our dear leader, President Trump, truthed on his Truth Social account?
I have seen the message about threatening to withhold funding and make certain protests, quote unquote, illegal. Yes. Mm-hmm.
That's right. Okay, so that statement does a couple of things. I'll just read it out loud. I keep scrolling off of it. He says, all federal funding will, all caps, stop for any college, school, or university that allows illegal protests. Agitators will be imprisoned / or permanently sent back to the country from which they came.
Outrageous.
Americans will be permanently expelled or, depending on the crime, arrested. All caps again, no masks. Thank you for your attention to this matter, which I think is my favorite part, the thank you for your attention to this matter. So there's a lot there, right? One of which is, what's an illegal protest?
Mm-hmm.
As you pointed out, the vast majority of protests are peaceful. School campuses are designed to allow for students to congregate, right? And then, why is this a post on the internet and not, a law? Probably because they don't want votes to make it a law, right? But what do you make of a statement like that by the president of a country?
Well, also, too, I'm increasingly finding that figure not terribly interesting, except to say that he is a meeting point of a number, for educational purposes, a number of different groups that have animus against universities. And so what's really, to me, the substance behind it is how he's propping up those groups, and they formed an alliance around him. And one side of that is the long-term self-described conservative or reactionary forces that, again, don't like education in the era of desegregation. But what we have now is a lot of private organizations. Musk is typical here, the Bezoses, the Googles, and so forth, the Silicon Valley people finding common cause in that triangle there with the current president and those conservatives in looking at universities, essentially, I think, as banks. That the federal government gives them a lot of resources, and that's why federal funding is mentioned in that post. This is a long-term project to look at universities as taking federal funds to produce, for example, amazing vaccine science,
right?
Amazing military applications, the diplomatic corps that our country is sustained by, nursing, tech, and so forth. Universities in the post-war period in the U.S., it was a very smart set of government and public partnerships, because instead of having to build government labs, they could take advantage of the world-class resources and intellect possible on many different U.S. college campuses. And a lot of amazing inventions that we use every day were done that way through pretty modest federal funding. And what that federal funding amounts to, I think it's about 8% of the total U.S. budget. So we're talking single digits, but that modest investment from the standpoint of the federal system makes operating costs so much better for universities overall. But if you're somebody who is in the tech sector running a Google or an Apple, you see, well, why doesn't that federal money come to me? And then I can control and take credit for all of this. So it's a fascinating post because it sort of gives insight into that long-term federal funding issue. The private sector wants it, and self-described conservatives don't want it to go toward the enrichment of university education for all.
Right.
And then behind that as well, the idea of people being deported off college campuses, that's also a very nice piece of misinformation, in the sense that college campuses are places, again, which are remarkably diverse now, because they accept a lot of international students. In part, that's what a university should do. It should be part of an international consortium of learning, cultural exchanges, and so forth, because that not only promotes the home country, that promotes the greater social and political order and economic one in general. The thing that I think a lot of people don't realize who want to, quote unquote, deport students with visas on college campuses is that every time you see an international student, by and large, they are subsidizing the tuition of domestic students. They make college much more affordable for people already in the U.S. So it's amazingly ignorant in some ways. And the idea of, quote unquote, illegal protests, this is just a long-term reactionary, self-described conservative effort in think tanks to make protest on campuses illegal or to criminalize protected First Amendment liberties. This goes way back, and we've seen it really ramp up in recent years. And the authoritarian part of that is, again, even in a relatively closed society, where are the forces for greater liberalization going to come from? College campuses are usually one of them. Usually movements for greater social rights and democracy, even in repressive regimes, are student-led movements in part.
Yeah. Okay, so let me know if I have this timeline correct. Essentially, we have broad public support in the early 20th century of universities and K-12 schools as a public good. We put money into them because they do something we need. Brown v. Board happens, desegregation happens, and then a movement of massive resistance works to erode people's comfort with the idea of public education. And then in the 2010s, we have all of these polls coming out saying people don't really like universities very much. They don't trust them very much. And we all have to scratch our chins about it and go, gosh, why could that be? Maybe it's because they're hotbeds of wokeness and Marxism.
Mm-hmm. In broad strokes, I'd say for sure. And that, and that the American reactionaries who don't like university campuses are certainly learning from authoritarian regimes abroad. Yeah.
Well, again, I think that timeline is functionally, as broad strokes, correct. It seems to me that I've been reading Anti-Intellectualism in America by Hofstadter again, and he basically talks about like the history before that, Caitlin, of the consortium of business leaders and business ideas that comes across from the 17th century onward of the different strains of puritanical religions, the cosmopolitan versus the sort of rural. And it strikes me that universities represent a sort of cosmopolitan hub of not only intellectualism, which is disdained by many, but culturally, right? It is a place where not only the smartest come or people come to learn more information, but all sorts of different people, all sorts of different cultures that we're not comfortable with. And this seems to me to play a part in this sort of subconscious and then eventually conscious bias.
Mm-hmm. That's kind of baked into what a university is. The first codified protections for academic freedom with the University of Bologna. I'm going way back now.
Nice.
The first Western university. We're literally talking 10th, 11th century here. It was all about travel, that you had scholars moving in and out of different provinces and little kingdoms and so forth. And what was the law in one or another? Could you be subject to political retribution for your ideas? And so the Holy Roman Emperor said, hands off the scholars, let them travel to and from freely the University of Bologna. And closer to our time in the Cold War period, a lot of European and American universities, of course, took in Soviet dissidents, the intellectuals, the academics, as well as cultural figures there. So part of what a university is has always been, in a way, international. And to nativist and ethno-nationalist forces, that's a great threat, as well as political forces that want to think about universities only as workforce training for the benefit of the patriotic state.
What I absolutely couldn't agree more, practically speaking. I mean, in the Ottoman Empire during hundreds of years, it was quite reasonable to go from like Damascus to Baghdad to wherever, and just keep going and learning and continuing your education in this sort of free-flowing experience that sort of probably helped to deter some forms of nationalism, for as long as it could, at least.
Absolutely.
I think one thing I really want to talk about is the Powell memo. You spend a little time on it in your book, and I think it is really telling, right, about kind of where things started to go in the late 60s, early 70s. What was the context in which the Powell memo was written?
It is written at a time of heightened desegregation, and I always find it, so the Powell memos, Associate Justice on the Supreme Court, Lewis Powell, this is a famous watershed moment that I think keeps being imitated again and again and again. It essentially says the society in the U.S. is changing the political, and I think he's even more concerned because it involves the Department of Commerce, I believe. It's addressed in a way where we have this changing economic order, and capitalism is coming under assault in free markets and such. So the background to all of this, which I find instructive, is desegregation. It's more "quote unquote" minorities in the height of the "quote unquote" rights revolution being accepted in all walks of society. So he talks about the media, but also college campuses as well as the private sector, and there is prejudicial code in that letter. That letter says, they have, I'm only paraphrasing here, but there's more eloquent and charismatic speakers who on the side of increasing liberalization and so forth. And so that's I think, a pretty obvious code to say there's more people who we're not used to associating with now in the club, so to speak. And to his credit, he says we shouldn't push them out. We just need to assert conservative voices equally in these institutions. And I think that's become a model. And the background there is kind of fascinating because I always like to pair, and I'm not suggesting there's an absolutely direct connection, but if we just think of the times and the context for that letter, I always like to pair the much lauded Calvin statement from '67 from the University of Chicago, which a lot of people take disingenuously. Sure. It's a misreading of the letter. This is not about Calvin. It's about a misreading that's contemporary to say that that's the University of Chicago saying we need to remain kind of culturally or socially conservative and neutral in public controversies. Part of the background for that letter, which continues on into the early 70s, is Ivy League schools saying we will be proactively admitting more minority populations. We are going to actively help to desegregate. And University of Chicago is a little bit of an outlier there, actually. UPenn does this. Cornell does this. The Ivy League takes proactive steps there. And so I think, from the Calvin letter to them, when Powell is writing, they're seeing institutions which were traditionally very cloistered, very exclusive, starting to open the door a little bit. And they want to mitigate the diversifying effects of doing so.
Yeah, I was running around yesterday pulling my hair out deciding to keep your policies exactly the same is a decision. That's not neutral. Like, you can't say we're doing neutrality, by which I mean not changing any of our currently existing policies on how we treat our school as a business, right? So
Sure.
the Calvin report was at least partly about what are we doing with our money? Like, do we divest from South Africa or not? Because that's something that the students had been asking of them. And to say no is a decision. But if you can frame it as this is neutrality, then it doesn't look so much like a decision on the outside. I, a couple of years ago, did attend the Stanford Business School's conference on academic freedom, which was extremely instructive because I got to hear a lot of the exact same phrases or like paraphrases of things that were in the Powell memo. So the Powell memo, which is saying like essentially communism is corrupting our
Yes.
universities and our culture, right? And in some cases, it's evil Marxist communists trying to bring us down, and in some ways, it's like unwitting pawns who are attracted by the beautiful speech of the evil Marxists that are trying to bring us down. And they bring up that students on campuses are shouting mindless slogans, that they're irrational. It's a mob mentality, right? That's stuff that we hear today all the time.
Mm-hmm.
It asserts the necessity of a balanced viewpoint. That's a direct quote.
Mm-hmm.
Feels like viewpoint diversity or viewpoint parity that we hear all the time now. And it names academic freedom as like the number one goal, right? The number one sanctified value in American life is academic freedom,
Mm-hmm.
and then goes on to suggest we would really like for the Chamber of Commerce to be able to edit textbooks.
Right.
So as an example of good academic freedom, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we want to start some like publications. We want to get our words out there. We want to befriend some TV hosts, right? It's all about kind of
Mm-hmm.
finding ways to counter the trend that's happening by figuring out how to create mechanisms by which our words become more consumed by the average person.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought it was interesting the way that this idea of like mindless slogans and irrationality gets used to take away the sense that the person opposite you has a brain
Mm-hmm.
and has come to these ideas
Mm-hmm.
by thinking about them rather than just because it's a slogan that like rhymes and that's cool.
Right.
So you talk a lot about that, about talking about mob mentality, about irrationality, about things being a religion that aren't a religion.
Yes.
That's a pretty common refrain, right?
Yes, and that goes back to the what I was saying earlier, that there's always this layer of description that takes things away from an accurate or representative depiction of reality in these cases. And it's in the examples you're describing, to say that college campuses are fomenting another cultural revolution under Mao. The scholars who actually study the Cultural Revolution will say, when that shows up in an op-ed page, that's just wildly ahistorical and irresponsible. There's no comparison, or comparing things to the Salem.
Everyone look fondly on the days on campus of doing struggle sessions.
Yeah,
It's so nice.
all those.
What a good time.
Yeah. And so all those forms of imagery they're ridiculous. They make no sense, and we should not hesitate to call them that. And so there's these layers of verbal description where things go incredibly meta. And in my book, I call it a kind of echo chamber of meta discourse. And I think a lot of people have gotten wrapped into that meta discourse because it presents this alarming, dystopian, but also maybe kind of thrilling, exciting, dramatic, melodramatic narrative of allegedly what's happening on these campuses that helps them make sense of the world. And with reference to the Powell memo, I think that sense-making pattern is part of power, social and political power and status. So what's outlined in that memo and what's consistently part of the storytelling about these campuses is, okay, why so much focus on universities? Because we're also going to focus on, quote unquote, the media and the economic or political order. So if you think about the worldview here, it takes the assumption that universities should be places for training the elite leadership in media circles and in the political and economic order. And if you diversify campuses and let them be, naturally complex and egalitarian as they are, you're going to come out with a different order of public information and a different social and economic order. It's going to change that leadership structure.
Right.
And so I think these stories are very much about historically privileged, cloistered set of leaders or people who want to identify with these institutions in a certain way, telling them these stories in a kind of meta discourse so that they don't have to engage with, as you say, on a campus, it's probably a sign of democracy and free speech that you do have a minority amount of people expressing certain, quote unquote, radical views. And so let's talk those through and where those come from and learn from and get to a better place, as opposed to distancing ourselves and saying all these other people are crazy and I'm the only sane one.
Yeah. they're irrational, they're NPCs, they're just animals, right? I think it's really interesting the amount of psychologizing that kind of happens in that space, right? Where like especially Jordan Peterson, he loves to do that because he has the background. And so say, oh, he was talking about Jay Bhattacharya, right, who experienced some protests and some posters about him because of his COVID response. So he says, Jay Bhattacharya talked about the consequences of being mobbed. So what happens is the narcissistic and psychopathic Machiavellians, they figure out how to isolate people. Like predators isolate their prey in a group and then they mob them. And then he talks about how it's so traumatic, right? Which, like, yeah, if a gang of, what was it, psychopathic Machiavellians mobbed me like sharks, I would be traumatized too, right? But with that's so many different like buzzwords and jargon and metaphor on top of each other that you almost can't get to what the actual claim is, right, at the bottom.
Right. Jordan Peterson is a very effective stylist. The scholarly heft is very questionable. He did not come to public prominence because of his scholarly achievements, as meritorious as they might have been before his fame. He came to prominence because he normalized what was a very entertaining and exciting way of denigrating other human beings that got a lot of attention. And so that's the gig. And the connection with something like social psychology is, yes, a lot of the campus misinformation rhetoric is very much indebted not to responsible social sciences, but to misuses of it. And the stylistic aspect, a lot of this is an extension and in extremity of a genre that was present in the 2000s and 2010s of kind of quasi-scientific public writing. Malcolm Gladwell, in my mind, is the paradigmatic example. Malcolm Gladwell is a journalist who learned he can create best-selling books that make people think they've really learned something through the stylistic use of social scientific terminology. He's not an expert in these things, and there's been all kinds of exposés where when he asks questions like, why are there more airplane crashes in South Korea? You know, do South Korean pilots have some sort of social scientific difference there that explains this?
This is a good chance to plug one of my favorite podcasts, Controlled Pod into Terrain, which is about aviation disasters. And they talk about this chapter because it's so upsetting what he did.
Or the idea that, you know, you'll become an expert if you practice something for 10,000 hours, except all the people who will not become experts. After
Right. And it has a kernel of some research somewhere, but he's extrapolated way beyond reason and applied things where they don't apply, right? And come up with this pat rule that applies to everything in your life.
Yeah,
right?
And I think this is the perfect stylization and why many people, even if they're not originally social scientists themselves, when they write these polemics that I described, they're drawing from that terminology because it's very easy then to say, well, look at these 5 or 6 students who disrupted this campus speech. And let's look at their ideology. Let's psychologize them, if you will. And if that's going on, that's my data point for drawing these big conclusions about, you know, the sociology or the psychology of a college campus. It's totally irresponsible. But if you do that in a stylistically entertaining and persuasive way, people who are not initiated in that social science will think they're learning something and think they have a scientific basis to be outraged. And meanwhile, it becomes very marketable and celebrity producing for people like Jordan Peterson.
Right. You're selling their own bias to them wrapped up in this beautiful performative education. And who doesn't love that?
Some new fancy words so they get to feel like they had a good reason for believing the thing in the first place, right? So you get to say Machiavellianism and then they feel really good.
That's what I would say,
I was really surprised. This was early in my sort of journey, right? By Jonathan Haidt, right? Because he was somebody that I thought of as being like really well credentialed, and he's written some things that are not totally out of the realm of possibility. But then he goes to this event and he stands up in front of the lectern and he says things like, well, in the 2010s, like all of the 18-year-old women went insane, and that's why they have to be coddled, and that's why they think words are violence, and that's why we have campus wokeness, which like that's such a wild thing to say. That's such a big claim. And of course, he's going to say it at a lectern in front of a friendly audience because he couldn't get it into a journal.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But that kind of psychologizing and dehumanizing of the people who at the time were my students, that definitely did get me interested in getting in some fights about it.
Is that right? Yeah.
You get defensive of your kids, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where I was like, nobody in my class is doing stuff like that. Nobody in any of my classes are doing stuff like that. They are just being people trying to pursue an education, doing things right sometimes, doing things wrong sometimes, which is the life of a person on campus,
Mm-hmm.
just like the life of a person anywhere else, right?
Right.
So yeah, the kind of wild metaphors, the psychologizing, writing people off as irrational, I thought these are sort of attacks on the character of a large group of people as opposed to an argument about a trend that we could maybe talk about working on if it were a problem, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. And that the stylization aspect is very present in the coddling of the American mind there. Yeah, it's mostly a stylistic exercise.
So as somebody who's looked through all of these polemics and done your analysis, what are some things that you would like to see people, just regular people consuming media, thinking about or asking themselves when they see claims about what's happening on campuses?
A few things come to mind. One is, okay, so you don't like the direction of what's going on a university campus. And if you do think universities in the abstract are good, what would make it better? Will all these headlines and saying things like universities have failed and all professors and students are cultural Marxists, does that actually make it better? They're not only false, but if you do believe in these things, what is your responsibility as an individual consumer of news or as somebody who might be part of a university community to promote the betterment of those institutions, if you truly believe in the institution? The other is to be aware of how these largely pieces of misinformation about college campuses are, in a way, exploitative of the audience. They're addictive, outrage generating kinds of rhetoric. And so if you feel yourself getting caught up in cycles of outrage and frustration about the alleged state of all college campuses, there's a very different experience happening on those campuses. And I can guarantee you that I always like to say the people who are most frustrated and critical of colleges and universities are in faculty senates. There's no shortage of criticism about universities happening on campuses, but it goes in a different direction. It goes to trying to improve things and being frustrated about barriers to improvement. It doesn't go to overgeneralizing and denigrating entire groups of students and faculty.
Right.
And then the third piece, if one is whether you belong to a campus or not, if you're truly interested in the state of higher education, look up good investigative reporting. There's no shortage of it. And good information about what the typical student and faculty life actually entails. The typical allegedly coddled, privileged undergraduate in the U.S. is not in an Ivy League school, not by a long shot. They're probably at a quote-unquote second-tier state school somewhere. They're probably working a job or two part-time, and then they're going to have student debt and maybe some family hardships on top of that because the system has made it so difficult for a large portion of the public to get through a 4-year typical education. So look into actually the people you're talking about. They're real-life people. They're more diverse and sort of average and ordinary, not elitist. The most elitist sources of talk about institutions of education in the U.S. themselves are not being honest about these basic facts in many respects.
I think a couple of things that you said sort of come back to the idea that you need to think about the way that your perspective is being narrowed by these op-eds, where the broad banner is academic freedom, but then it's actually at elite institutions and only in the specific case, i.e. like, woke mobs and thought policing, when if you're really interested in academic freedom as a concept, you need to expand the topic to what are the actual barriers that stand in the way of people pursuing the research they want to do, the learning they want to do, and the teaching that they want to do, right? Mm-hmm. Is it really objections from students to a word that they used? Or are there other things that have a bigger impact, like structural barriers, discrimination, money, the sort of financial structure of a university, that kind of thing.
Right. Exactly.
It seems to me that the term academic freedom, when used by certain individuals, is euphemistic, right? It is the freedom to think within this box. And we might close our eyes and think of a time when, the Catholic Church, the Pope, yeah, you have religious freedom. Just you believe it exactly within this, but within this, you have all the freedom you want. Go anywhere you want in that, right? But it's right, and we do the same thing in society, right? It's express yourself how you like, as long as how is right here, right? And so, as you noted, Doctor, we have this hyperbole that coats what we mean. Like a sweet little protective shield, and you only know it if you're like trying to look at it. Otherwise it's easy to just ignore or obfuscate.
Yeah, I think we've come to an interesting point, which is that when people are being misled, it's often because some terms are being stretched too far to cover things they don't cover, and some things are being narrowed in a way that we don't notice to only make us think about certain things, right? So a widening and narrowing. I always like to come up with like a theme.
Absolutely. Well, I think it's very much of this is manipulation of language around both academic freedom and free speech, for sure. Yeah.
So glad I could force it to be about language, and it turned out to be perfectly natural. I didn't have to work too hard. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Vivian, for coming to speak to us. I had such a great time. I learned so much from the book. There's a lot more in it. I really recommend that people pick it up. It's called Campus Misinformation: The Real Threat to Free Speech in American Higher Education.
Thank you so much. It's great. Delight.
Dr. Bradford Vivian, you got to come back, though. Because like Caitlin just said, there's way too much in the book. We got to go through more stuff. Will you come back sometime?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I don't think, unfortunately, these issues are going to go away. I think they're going to intensify.
No, that's right. Oh, we gotta do a whole thing on institutional neutrality. Like, there's a whole lot going on.
Yeah, and I'm trying to push forward with some other writing and think about what next steps might be. So, yeah, I really appreciate your...
Well, you've got an audience right here ready for it. So.
Thank you so much.
And again, we really appreciate it, sir. The name of the program is Half the Answer, because understanding a question is half an answer. And you certainly provided us with a great deal of answers, so we appreciate you.
I like that. Well, no, thanks for having me. It's great to see y'all.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Have a beautiful day, sir.
Take care.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Half the Answer, presented by Liberal Currents. You can find Half the Answer anywhere you get your podcasts. Liberal Currents is an entirely listener and subscriber-funded publication, which includes programs like Half the Answer and Neon Liberalism. So, if you like what you've heard and wish to contribute, you may do so at liberalcurrents.com and through Patreon. And remember, understanding a question is half the answer.